Our next presenter is Lise Aubry. She is a population ecologist interested in quantifying the impacts of anthropogenic factors such as climate change and habitat fragmentation on the ecology, demography, and microevolution of wild species. She is interested in how wild populations respond to management actions and conservation practices. Please welcome Lise Aubry.
So let's see if this will work for me. Up towards this. Could have told you that. Yeah, thanks for having me. Yeah. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Fortunately, I missed most of the conference so far. My little daughter has been sick the last few days. But I was able to look over the program, and I saw that you guys learned a lot about the impacts of climate change on water, soils, vegetation, forests, of course, even human perception, but I'm pretty sure I'm the only wildlife biologist here presenting today. So the common theme of this conference is climate change and restoration. I'm going to talk about climate change and conservation of wildlife. And I'm going to focus on a species that I think can tell us a lot about the impacts of climate change on wildlife here in the Western US. Wildlife biologists like to study very charismatic species and brag about them. I'm going to talk about squirrels. So don't leave the room. I'll try to make it interesting. I think they're a really fun and interesting organism to work with within the framework of climate change. So, yes. I think I will start first by telling you a little bit about what I do and how I got interested in climate change impacts on wildlife. I'm a population ecologist, and so population ecologists study how animal and plant populations change in their size and composition over time and over space. And those changes are mostly due to the kind of environmental conditions that those populations experience over time. And so, as a population ecologist, I study things like birth rates, death rates, migration rates, and how those things balance out over time. So population ecology is really a game of numbers, but it also has to abide by a number of ecological and evolutionary laws. And Evelyn Hutchinson put it best when he says that the ecological theater can really influence the evolution of populations and population dynamics. So, population dynamics, like I said, abides by ecological and evolutionary laws, and I want to try to make that more concrete. So when I think of ecological forces that can shape the size and composition of a population, I might think of something like predation, right? If you think of a pack of wolves in Yellowstone hunting down a herd of elk, they tend to go for the weakest individuals in the population, so probably the youngest and the oldest elk in the population. So through that predation event, you're affecting not only the size of the prey population, but also its age composition by removing the youngest and oldest individuals. So that's kind of an ecological force that can really shape and change population size and composition over time. Evolutionary processes can also affect populations in that way. We know that, except if you're working with clones maybe, and even then, individuals within populations are different. Some might contribute most to the next generation by living longer lives and reproducing more. And so those differences across individuals can scale up to really affect the genetic architecture of a population and its growing power over time. So population ecology, game of numbers, abides by ecological and evolutionary laws and involves three levels of organization mostly: genes, individuals, and populations. Ecologists come in all kinds of flavors. Some might focus on just one level of organization. Some might work across all of them. I started by basically studying how individuals and their characteristics scale up to affect population dynamics. And now I find myself asking questions that involve genes, individuals, populations, all the way up to ecosystems. So it's becoming more challenging, but I think it's also more exciting. So at this point, population ecology might sound very theoretical to you, but I think there's a lot of very tangible applications to population ecology. And one of the first ones, I think, is conservation biology. conservation biology, or the conservation of threatened and endangered species, has to do about preserving abundance, for instance. And abundance, one of the central tenets of the Endangered Species Act, is something that we study as population ecologists. So it's not surprising that a number of population ecologists are specializing in the conservation of endangered species. Another outcome of population ecology is population control, for the exact opposite reasons. Some population ecologists really focus on ways to decrease population size and prevent expansion of pests and invasive species. And another thing that is, I think, an outcome of population ecology is wildlife management. A lot of us work with wildlife management on the ground to set things like harvest quotas so that we can maintain sustained populations for anglers and hunters. So I think that's why I really like population ecology. It's theoretical in essence, but there's a number of very applied outcomes to it that I think are important. And so it's about how individuals within a population interact with their surrounding environment and how that affects population dynamics. And we are now in the era of the Anthropocene, where us humans are really altering our ecosystems in unprecedented ways. And so population ecologists right now are really busy dealing with habitat fragmentation, pollution, overexploitation, climate change. And I think to really be able to do something about those anthropogenic changes and how they affect wildlife, you really need to get at the mechanisms of those effects. And so here I am talking about anthropogenic change and climate change in particular. I am by no means a climate change expert. You have had experts, I think, address you over the past couple days. But like I said, I'm a population ecologist, and I study how individuals respond to changes in their environment. And because the environment is being affected by humans so much, it's only natural that myself and a number of my colleagues really are interested in climate change impacts on wildlife. There's a magic optimal angle or something. When we study climate change impacts, and this has been done for a few decades now when it comes to wildlife studies, what we're seeing are mostly ecological shifts, right? So we're seeing different types of ecological shifts as responses to wildlife, responses to climate change. And so the first type of shift that we're seeing are geographical and shifts and contractions in ranges. And so here you can see a picture of a tree line in Switzerland that has been moving upwards over time to try to escape warming temperatures and seeking cooler ones. There's also studies that have shown that Arctic foxes are suffering a contraction of their southern range in response to warming temperatures. Another type of shift that we're studying and that we're seeing a lot of studies focusing on are seasonal shifts. So we're seeing things like changes in flowering time, changes in fruiting time. Were you able to hear me up to this point? Okay, good. Now I hear my echo. I'm like, oh. So anyways, another type of shift we've been seeing are seasonal shifts. So changes in flowering time, changes in fruiting time in plants. We're also seeing changes in the timing of massive migration events and changes in the timing of basically phenological traits, right? The timing of key life cycle events in wildlife populations and plant populations. And the last type of shift that we're really seeing are extreme event shifts. So in response to climate change, we're seeing a lot more extreme events. And I think this is something that has just more recently been studied. And I'm talking about things like micro or macro events. So think of a flash flood, for example, or think about iceberg collisions. Those things recently have been shown to displace wild populations or even eradicate populations altogether in certain cases. So it sounds pretty gloomy, right? We're seeing all those climate change impacts that are leading to all those ecological shifts, and the questions is, how populations are really going to respond, how species are going to respond beyond those shifts. Are they going to disappear altogether or not? And what we're seeing is that some are actually adapting to the changes. Some are moving in response to those climate changes. Some might die and go extinct altogether, and a few species might even thrive in response to, say, things like warming temperatures. And so I think I want to illustrate that because some of those studies are really fascinating. In terms of adaptation, there's actually very few studies around the world that really show evolutionary response to climate change in wild populations. And one of the really, I think, best studies of that is a study of the European banded snail. You can find them throughout continental Europe, and there's mostly two color morphs, the ones with the lighter color shells and some with the darker color shells. And we know that it's mostly heritable, and we know which genes are responsible for those colorations, and we also know that the ones with the lighter color shells respond better to warming temperatures because they can basically reflect off the sun better, and they tend not to desiccate as much as the ones that have the darker color shells. What this evolutionary study has shown is that in response to warming temperatures in the Netherlands over the past couple of decades, we're seeing that the light color shells are taking over. They're being selected for, basically. Another type of response that we're seeing in light of climate change are populations moving in response mostly to those dramatic events that I was talking about earlier, like flash floods and things like that. And I think us humans are the perfect example of that, unfortunately. In response to those catastrophic climatic events, we tend to disperse and move away. Some species are not making it and will not make it in the future, and this is an example that is close to home for me. It's the Pyrenees frog. So they live in those mountains that separate France from Spain, and they've been moving upwards in elevation in response to warming temperature, but they're basically at a point now where there's no other place to go. So it's only a matter of years before they go extinct. And the last example is the example of the wood mouse. You can find it throughout continental Europe, and that might be one of those species that is actually going to do well in response to warming temperature and expand its range in response to that. They have those traits that really allow them to invade new habitats, though they're very adaptable in terms of their diet, in terms of the habitats that they can colonize. They reproduce frequently and produce large number of offsprings, and so they have all those characteristics that really allowed them to colonize easily new habitats. And so the study in this case shows that we think they will expand towards places like Norway, Sweden, and Finland in the future in response to warming temperature. So I've always been interested in the impacts of environmental change in wildlife, and the focus was not always on climate change, but the species that are highlighted in green here are the species that I work with within the broad framework of climate change. I actually don't work on prairie dogs yet, but I'm really hoping to, so they're up there. And the species I want to talk about today is this little guy. And if you spend time hiking in the Rocky Mountains, you've seen those guys around. They're the Uinta ground squirrel. They are rodents from the Surid family. They're abundant. You can find them all through the Rocky Mountains in the western US. They're considered a pest by a lot of people because they're a vector for a number of diseases. And I've been told that in the area, people like to use them for target practice so that they can teach their kids how to shoot. So, not really the poster child for a climate change study. But I think they're actually the perfect species to work with here in the western US to understand the impacts of climate change on wildlife locally. And I think that what we find here could have implications not only for similar species in terms of belonging to the Surid family, but also for species that play a similar functional role within prairie ecosystems. And I'll get back to that in a minute. So we're talking about a study that is taking place in Utah, and I'm sure you've seen some of those figures over the past couple of days. Across the state over the past 50 years, we've seen a 2.7 degree increase in average ambient temperatures. And if that doesn't mean a lot to us for a hibernator, because Uinta ground squirrels are hibernators, even very small changes in temperature can really mess up their phenology and potentially their fitness and potential for persistence. Climate change and warming in particular has been shown to really mess up with the seasonal endpoints of important life cycle events. So for hibernators, that would be the timing of when you come out of hibernation and the timing of when you go back into estivation. And so just small changes in temperature can really shift that and modify the length of the above ground season, which is this very short window that they have to fatten up to survive the next hibernation bout. And so modifying those seasonal endpoints can really have implications for this species and other hibernating species. So that's, I think, one of the reasons why, as hibernators, they're really sentinels or indicators of climate change, and that's why I think they're important to study. Another reason why I really wanted to work on Uinta ground squirrels is that studies have shown that for those Surid species that are really closely related, you find very different phenological responses to climate change depending on where you are. So, for instance, here on the left is a very nice long-term study of yellow-bellied marmots in Colorado, and they have shown that in Colorado, in that part of the world, with climate change comes warming temperatures in the winter, and in the spring they come out of hibernation a little earlier. They have a longer above-ground season, and the vegetation is responding in a way that it's available to them when they come out of hibernation. So they now have a longer time period to fatten up during the above ground season than they used to 20 years ago. And that allows them to improve their overwinter survival throughout the years. So this is a situation where, at least for now, this population is responding positively to climate change in Colorado. Now, on the other hand, here on the right-hand side, we have the Arctic ground squirrel study in Alberta, Canada, and this particular populations are not doing as good. What happens there with climate change is the increased frequency of spring snowstorms. So when those guys come out of hibernation, they don't have access to food. Their food is covered up by snow. And so that shortens the above-ground season and the period of time that they have to fatten up, meaning that it comes along with a decrease in overwinter survival and a decrease in fitness overall. So here we are with two closely related species that have very similar life cycles, yet they're responding very differently to climate change. So I think it's important to work with the species locally if we want to say anything about what we would expect here in Utah and in this part of the world. The last reason and the most important reason why I really wanted to work on this species is because we have a wealth of historical data available to us. So back in the 60s and 70s, a number of USU scientists worked on Uinta ground squirrels, got funding from NIH and NSF to maintain this study for about 20 years, excuse me. So those pictures were taken right before the beginning of the study in the 50s at the Forest Refill Station in Logan Canyon. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this site. And so from back in those days, we have all kinds of information on the phenology, the demography, and the behavior of populations across an elevation gradient. So here on the top part, you can see over a 3-year period, a population of ground squirrel emerging over time in terms of its abundance. So usually adult males come out first, followed by adult females, juveniles, and then the pups are born later in the season. And so you have it broken down by age and sex, and below there at the bottom part, you have actually body mass dynamics for 3 populations of Uinta ground squirrels at 3 different elevations. So this is just a snapshot of the kind of data that I have available to me so that I can revisit those sites 50 years later, see how things have changed in response to the warming that we know has occurred over the past 50 years. We also have, very good demographic information on those populations. So there's a couple of population ecologists back in the day basically collected all kinds of information on age-specific and sex-specific demography and population dynamics for these populations. Patience. Next. Thank you. In 2013, I decided to revisit those sites to see whether there was potential for a study there. What I found is that what used to be the lowest elevation site in Cache Valley is now gone. And actually, I've been all over Cache Valley and was unable to find a single colony of Uinta ground squirrels, mostly because of urbanization of the area, but potentially because of climate warming. It's possible they've already started to move up in elevation in response to that, but I have no ways to prove that. So the lowest elevation site is now the Forest Refill Station, and the highest elevation site is located at Tony Grove Lake, which was also historically studied. And then we picked a mid-elevation site at Selman Reservoir. So these studies span an elevation range of about 2,200 feet. So we started revisiting those sites and started Mercury Capture studies at each of those elevations using live traps that are baited. We capture individuals and we anesthetize them. We individually mark them with pit tags and we recapture them over time so that we can estimate things like survival and abundance. We also measure them, basically assess their reproductive state, their sex, their age, take blood from them to inform things like immunocompetence, so physiological measurements, use fecal corticosterone to assess stress response to their environmental conditions, and collect pathogens to see if they're carrying any diseases. Next. I'm just going to give up on this. What we're trying to accomplish here is to see how things have changed over a 50-year period in response to climate change. And so we're working over this 50-year time period, which is kind of nice to draw the comparison. We're also working along an elevation gradient because what we're seeing is across those different elevations, we're seeing different life history strategies. Those populations, although very close to one another, are having to deal with slightly different microclimatic conditions. The lowest elevation site, for example, has a much longer above ground season than the highest elevation site within 1 year. So this is kind of a natural experiment for us. We don't have to manipulate temperature or the phenology of the squirrels or the phenology of the food they depend on for survival, because that variability is already naturally occurring along that elevation gradient, which provides a nice, again, natural experiment for us to address our questions. Next. Thank you. So the first thing we really had to think hard about are what are the climatic variables that could really affect the fitness of the species. And based on what's published out there and what we know of the species, I think winter climate change is what matters for them the most, in that they really depend on snow insulation during the hibernation phase to be buffered against or protected against variability in temperature during those crucial winter months. And what we're seeing over the past few decades and what we're going to see more in the future in Utah is that precipitation is falling more as rain than as snow. So there's a loss of snow insulation that potentially those hibernators could suffer from. And so those are really the climate variables that we're going to be focusing on. What we're trying to do, like a lot of other studies before us, it look at the impacts of climate change and winter climate change in particular on the demography of the species. But we also want to get at the mechanisms that really govern changes in fitness, and this is why we're doing a little bit of physiology here as well. Next. So the first objective is to work with the contemporary data that we have collected and for which we have physiological information, and work along an elevation gradient to see how those different microclimatic conditions can affect things like immunocompetence and stress responses to changes in their environment. And this is work that a master student, Kelly Falvo, is doing in collaboration with the French lab here at USU. Next. And the second big objective is to look at, utilize the historical data to see how the demography and the fitness of these populations have changed in response to warming over the past 50 years. And the prediction there is with the loss of snow cover that we have seen, we expect that they have to draw from their fat reserves, at a higher rate than they used to 50 years ago, and should thus emerge out of hibernation in poorer condition today than they used to 50 years ago, with a whole suite of cascading effects on different fitness components and potentially population persistence. We also expect to see different responses along the elevation gradient because of those different life history strategies that I was talking about. Next. The last objective, which is something that is not even close to happening as of right now, but is really something that I'm really excited about, is really start looking at heritability and plasticity in those phenological and demographic traits. Phenotypic plasticity is really a mechanisms by which wild populations have a better chance at responding to changes like climate change. And so to study those things, there's different ways to go about it, but to be able to measure those traits in individuals of node relatedness is the key, so that you can build animal models of quantitative genetics to try to separate what's genetic and heritable to what's plastic. And so this is something that will take a lot of work, but I'm hopeful that we'll get it done eventually. Next. Now the question is beyond what I think are exciting scientific questions. You might not agree, but that's fine. Is why does this work matter? How do I justify this to a broader audience, this kind of research? Well, ground squirrels, like a lot of sister species within the sciurid family, really play a key functional role within prairie ecosystems. A lot of other species depend on them for subsistence. So they have different functions in that, for example, they're burrowers, so they increase soil aeration and drainage and really improve the quality of prairie habitats. That helps provide a suitable habitat for prairie-dependent species. It helps provide better forage quality for a number of herbivores. Most importantly, they serve as a very important prey base for meso and top carnivores, predators in general. Next. So this functional role that they play, and they've been called ecosystem engineers, the roles that those species play has been shown around the globe. And so this is a nice study by Davidson et al., Frontiers in Ecology, that basically shows a number of not just cirrid species, but species that are kind of play similar functional roles around the globe. And unfortunately for us, most of those species are actually on the decline worldwide. Next. Some of the most dramatic cases of that would be the Vancouver Island marmot. They were down to about 30 individuals a few years ago, and thanks to some restoration efforts have been brought up to about 250. We have some examples closer to home of threatened cirrids. I'm thinking about the northern Idaho ground squirrel, for example. Yeah, I think preserving those species and trying to get at the mechanisms that drive changes in fitness in response to climate change is key. Next. So I think a big part of my job, because I work on squirrels, I find myself having to justify why I work on them and why I think they're important functionally within those alpine and prairie ecosystems. And so a lot of this education has to do with, of course, training undergraduate students in the field, doing science talk for a more lay audience, doing workshops, participating in workshops and youth lessons for K through 12. Recently, we've been working with the Hogle Zoo. They were running a workshop sponsored by NOAA to try to teach K through 12 teachers in Utah how to talk about climate change to their students and why and how it's impacting wildlife in the state. So that was really, really fun and interesting. We also try to reach out to people through art and photography. So we've been working with Karsten Meyer here at USU on trying to basically render some photographies of the life cycle of the species and how it might be impacted by climate change. Next. The last thing I would really love to do in the future at the Forestry Field Station, there's so much research that has been done there, not just this kind of research, but so many like forestry work and other things. Running a citizen science project up at the Forestry Station would be a lot of fun. There's a lot of very successful citizen science projects that focus on hibernators exclusively. There's a very nice study at La Grande Sessière in the French Alps where they have people fly from all around the world and pay their way to collect data for scientists on alpine marmots. And they just have this kind of little pamphlet that shows like, okay, you should come to the French Alps, you see the amazing wildlife, you'll eat the best cheese in the world, and you'll get to play with little marmots. Well, I can argue that in Logan Canyon we can just do as good as that. It's beautiful as well. Our traps are much lighter, so it's a lot less work. I think those squirrels are as cute as those alpine marmots, and we have decent cheese, so I think we have a shot. And I'm French, so it's hard for me to say that. But I think there's potential for a great citizen science program up there, focused on wildlife, but also forestry, plants, and other things, and climate change impacts on basically the tree of life. Next. With that, I really would like to thank Kaylee Falvo, who's really the master student who's running the show now on this project, and she's doing an excellent job, very challenging job working at the interface between physiology, demography, and climate change. I would also really like to thank Megan, who invited me to this talk, who organized everything, and so she's just amazing. I want to thank the Ecology Center, National Geographic, and Ag Experiment Station for funding this research, and thanks for your attention. What would you classify it as?
Well, I went to school there in the 80s, and I recently went out this summer, and there's been a lot of in-migration of big-tooth maple, aspen.
Yeah, a lot of aspen.
And I'm wondering if you showed a historic photograph of the site, and from that vantage point, you cannot see buildings, whether they were there previous or now, from the advancement of the forest type. And I was just wondering, is it still prairie?
So there's smaller, based on photographies, there's smaller islands for sure. And they really live at the interface between those small patches of open habitat and aspen and stuff. So it's changed a lot, but they're still there. Whether they utilize the same vegetation is something that we're looking at right now. But it's mostly still, I think they mostly still depend on graminoids in the area.